Seeders, you join me again for another random Seeders video. And at the risk of the channel no longer becoming random, because I do seem to be making lots of videos about Star Wars, I did just have some thoughts that I wanted to make this video a week or so ago, but I never got around to it. Because I went for a second viewing of Rise of Skywalker. If you watched my review, my spoiler and no spoiler review, this is definitely a spoiler review, a second spoiler review. You may have detected that I was a bit perturbed, a little bit disappointed with Rise of Skywalker, and I'm making this video to correct that, because on the second viewing I really loved it. It was really strange. I did very much enjoy it the first time round, but there were one or two plot holes that were kind of grating. And then the second time I watched it, I kind of went to the cinema with some trepidation, thinking, you know, is this going to really kill the film off? Am I really going to hate the film after seeing it the second time? And the reverse happened. I actually ended up appreciating it even more the second time. I still haven't been to see it yet for a third time, but I hopefully will before it stops showing at our local cinema. But I probably should explain why the plot holes don't concern me as much. I suppose there were really two major things that concerned me. I wasn't so concerned about Palpatine coming back, because he'd already alluded in Revenge of the Sith that a power of the Sith is that of cheating death. So I was already sort of on board with that. And in fact, I really like the Palpatine character. I like Ian McDiarmid. I like everything about that. So I was already sort of on board with Emperor Palpatine coming back. The issue I had was, first of all, the lack of clarity on exactly his relationship with Rey. Was his child Rey's father or Rey's mother? And on the second viewing, it is clear that it's Rey's father who is his son. I suppose I still would have liked there to be a bit more backstory on Rey's father, because there's a whole story there, surely, of why it was that he, you could say, rebelled against his father. What were his motives in repudiating his father? That was all completely raced through, and I would have liked a bit more backstory there. But I was at least satisfied on second viewing that it was made clear that it was Rey's father who was Palpatine's son, whereas on the first viewing it wasn't really clear to me, or I obviously missed it. But the biggest plot hole, which I alluded to in my previous spoiler and I think no spoiler videos, was the whole issue of Palpatine having an entire galaxy-busting fleet at his disposal, when it had taken him an entire trilogy to reach the point where he had an empire to rule over. And then at the end of the Return of the Jedi, he is killed, so he's back to square one. And without being the Emperor anymore, he's still able to conjure up a whole new fleet with even more devastating power, or with equally devastating power to the Death Star. And that grated a lot for me, actually, because I already had issues with a similar problem with Force Awakens. There was a plot hole there where they create something that's far more sophisticated and far more deadly than the Death Star. And whereas the Death Star needed an entire film to explain how they managed to get the plans to destroy it, with Starkiller Base, they just look at a hologram for a few minutes and come up with an idea that works. And that will always great. But is it a similar issue with the Rise of Skywalker and with this huge fleet? Probably not on reflection, because it needn't be that this fleet was assembled post Return of the Jedi. It could have been his secret project even before Return of the Jedi, because interestingly they are old style Star Destroyers. They're the same style as you see in the original trilogy. So it's possible that he was stockpiling these Star Destroyers almost from the very beginning as his kind of emergency plan, his nest egg almost. And it's also possible that he had people working on a way of using the Death Star technology on a smaller, more mobile level, so that he could equip each of these Star Destroyers with these deadly weapons. Again, running as like a Black Ops project that no one, even Darth Vader, knew about. So the more I think about it, I realise I'm making excuses for it, but that's how I am allowed. That's how I can get to not just appreciating and enjoying Rise of Skywalker, but actually loving it by rounding off that, or filling in that plot hole with my own kind of story, which, who knows, maybe that's the official story, maybe it will be covered in a spin-off film, who knows, but that's how I personally am able to reconcile this phantom fleet that appears out of nowhere. And once I reconcile that issue, then the whole film opens up and I can just enjoy the spectacle of seeing all these characters together for one final adventure. And one thing that I really, really like about Rise of Skywalker is that it feels like a quest. I love films that take you on a quest, whether it's the Goonies, whether it's the Indiana Jones films. Previous Star Wars films haven't really felt like a quest that much. It's felt more like, oh, well, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. You're not really setting out on an adventure and this original team sticking together right to the end. And that is basically what happens in Rise of Skywalker. They realise what the problem is. They realise who the enemy is and what the enemy is doing, and they come up with a plan to get to the bottom of it and try and stop it. And so Rey, Finn, Poe, and you could say C-3PO all gather together at the beginning, and Chewie, of course, and they more or less manage to stick together right up to the point where Rey faces down with Kylo Ren. And that, by the way, was another deeply satisfying thing about Rise of Skywalker, was how that whole arc of Kylo Ren was resolved. And for all the criticisms of The Last Jedi, one thing that you can surely acknowledge is that Rian Johnson did a good job of continuing that arc of Kylo Ren as this deeply conflicted individual who was salvageable and who does develop in The Last Jedi a bond with Rey, so that when the two are facing down in Rise of Skywalker, it all makes sense that there is this, you could say, love-hate relationship between them. And the way the Kylo Ren's turning was handled, I think I said in the previous review videos, it's the most convincing turning either to or from the dark side that you will see in the entire franchise. Because Anakin Skywalker in the prequels, for me, was not remotely compelling. I watched recently Revenge of the Sith again, which incidentally I've come to appreciate. It's basically just a continuation of the awfulness of Attack of the Clones in terms of just cartoon robots and just nonsense, right up to the point where General Grievous gets killed. And then it starts to become a proper film because they've got rid of the stupid cartoon robots. And that's when you start to see a decent, compelling film. And it's then that obviously Anakin is turned by Palpatine. And again, it's just not compelling. 1 minute, Anakin is basically turned because he's so in love with Padme and so concerned about Padme. And the next minute, they're on Mustafar. Is it Mustafar? And having a full-on argument, Anakin and Padme, and to the point where he basically assaults her, causing her to die in childbirth. It's not remotely compelling. It's almost like, well, he has to become Darth Vader, so we're just going to give him these vague excuses, and he'll just become Darth Vader, and you're just going to have to swallow it. I never found that turning to the dark side particularly compelling. The turning back from Darth Vader right at the end, as I said before, it was basically just a deathbed conversion. He'd already seen that he'd been betrayed by the Emperor, and when the Emperor started to kill Luke, Darth Vader killed, or thought he killed, the Emperor, and there was some reconciliation between him and Luke, and that was it. It wasn't really a convincing turning. It was just a deathbed thing. Kylo, on the other hand, I mean, you're watching The Last Jedi, and for me personally, I was thinking, is Rey going to be turned, or is Kylo going to be turned? And what would that even look like? And when it finally happens for Kylo in Rise of Skywalker, I was utterly enthralled by the whole process, and I think for a large part it was down to Adam Driver's superb acting. I actually really rated Daisy Ridley's acting as well, incidentally. But that's one thing that I really appreciated about Rise of Skywalker. Both the conclusion of the Kylo Ren arc, really emotional, by the way, when Han Solo appears. I got quite emotional the second time round, watching his memory present itself. And I feel I can draw a line personally under the whole issue of where did this fleet come from, because obviously the Emperor, or Palpatine, has always been a very devious character, and it's possible that he'd planned this from the very beginning, that he'd foreseen that he would be defeated, and he wanted one last throw of the dice. And that also explains him setting, because that's one more thing that I was confused about. Who was he intending the fleet for? Because at the beginning he tells Kylo that he can have the fleet, and orders Kylo to go and kill Rey. And then all of a sudden it's, oh, well, I always intended this for you, Rey, because you're my granddaughter. Screw Kylo. So, which one is it? It was very unsatisfying how fickle the Emperor was in who was supposed to inherit his fleet. And the way I resolved that was to think, well, it would make sense for the Emperor to pit Rey and Kylo against each other so that he could then reward the victor with the fleet, bearing in mind that the whole issue of Sith legend and Sith magic, you could say, was that whoever the strongest of Kylo and Rey turned out to be would then strike down Palpatine, and Palpatine would somehow become one with them. So his spirit would somehow live on in whoever struck him down in the ceremony that he was proposing in the Sith temple. So it would make sense for him to want the most powerful out of Rey and Kylo to be the one who succeeded him, and the way this succession was supposed to take place in his mind was by him being struck down, and therefore through this Sith magic or whatever imbue himself into this victor. So that I also managed to square off that whole issue just by thinking about it. Whether that's what J.J. Abrams meant or envisaged, I have no idea. But that's sort of how I managed to square the circle. So you must forgive my rambling on about Star Wars. Hopefully that's pretty much it now. And the next random Cedars video can be truly random, and I can talk about something else entirely. But I did want to get that off my chest. And that's it.